Okay, so I'm going to start out with talking about some basic, fairly agreed principles. And that's actually going to be a relatively lightweight. No, that's right. I rearranged it. Sorry. And then we'll talk about the legitimacy. Okay, including a conjecture, which is some of my most recent work, which is the ongoing work of a PhD student as well, Chris Schmitz. And then I'm going to talk about how AI is built, and that's somewhat elaborate. Okay, and then I'll talk a little bit about governing AI, and then the 12 guidelines for responsible generative AI use is just some bullets. So then we can really start talking some more. I have a few extra slides at the end if we want to talk more about generative AI, but mostly I will talk about that tomorrow night. So I put them after the end in case the questions come up. So just so you know, there's a couple spare slides if necessary. Okay. So I don't know how to take a picture of UNESCO, but I just decided there's never enough women in slides about AI. So I'm a member of this team, although I missed this meeting. It's the Women for Ethical Artificial Intelligence. But one of the women right in the middle in red is Gabrielle Romero. And she organized a multi-year effort with UNESCO, but every country signed up to it, called the UNESCO Recommendation for the Ethical Application of Artificial Intelligence. So this is only one of several instruments, but I think it's the one with the most legitimacy because so many countries were really involved in it. And in fact, the only reason it's not a binding recommendation is the 4 countries that you want to guess? What are the 4 countries that would say this shouldn't be binding? The US had pulled out of UNESCO, which is probably the only reason we got this through at all. Okay, next guess. Yeah, I hear it whispered China. China was 1. 3 more? Huh? Anybody? Russia, okay. And what did you say? No. South Korea was okay with it. They loved it. Yeah. I'll tell you. I don't think you'll ever guess the last 2. It was Singapore and the UK, which may be what you first guessed, US. So maybe they kind of convinced their friends to do that. So I don't know. Anyway, so anyway, the OECD and a lot of even Google and companies often mention these things. So I'm using just a very small number of things. So it's this whole idea about safety. And in general, I'm skeptical when people talk about safe AI now, because the safety narrative has become something about the AI benevolently choosing to be safe itself. Okay, but normally when this was first introduced, it was more like product safety. We're saying, okay, you've really checked for this capacity. This idea that artificial intelligence, you're writing it now. So don't change the law to handle AI, change AI to handle the law, right? We've been working on the law for thousands of years. And so we shouldn't break it unless it's necessary. There's certain things about the changes of communication that may mean we have to update the law a little, but as much as possible, oblige the companies that build AI to build it in a way already compliant with existing law. Okay. And then there's this thing about transparency, and I'm actually going to come back to that. All right. But every single thing since the British principles has emphasized, which was like 2010, so it's one of the earliest, that has emphasized transparency and accountability. Okay. And then there's this thing about being human-centered. Okay. So the earliest, the British principles were written around describing human centering, but that wasn't one of the principles they mentioned. But there's 2 different meanings of human-centered. One is that it's not for the machine's own, this is very science fiction, and it's hard for some people to get their heads around. I was at MIT once. I was a guest speaker, but then I got to attend another thing with some famous economists. I think one had a Nobel Prize or whatever. But actually, one of the best economists in AI right now is named David Autor. And the students were asking a question about the welfare of the AI. And and he literally didn't understand what they were saying. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. They're worried about the AI itself. and he didn't know who I was. I was just a guest speaker. So he's looking at me like I'm totally crazy. And then I happened to be sitting next to Dan Dennett. So he had a lot of authority. He said, no, she's right. That's what they're saying, you know? So I emailed, I got to know David Otter afterwards, and he was just saying, he couldn't get his head around how it could be that people worry about the well-being of the instruments of capital, you know? But so anyway, but a lot of people, it's very intuitive. They have emotional, they identify with the AI, they have emotional attachment to it, they give it emotional consideration. And this has been going on for decades. So even when I was an undergraduate in the 1980s on the early Usenets, they're like bulletin boards, there were people that would say, are the robots going to be mad at us because we turned off computers at night? You know, that was a concern, right? So anyway, a lot of early effort in these kinds of policies were to get through, like diplomatically, the incoherence of the idea of the machine's benefit and to focus on the human's benefit. At least as a centering. Some of that is done as saying, well, if there is machine concern, that it's secondary. But in Europe, at least, a lot of this is starting to refocus. They're grabbing this narrative and sort of moving it over to talk about wealth. So there's a concern, so they're using the human centering to say this is about the people. It is not only about the companies, which, as we were talking about earlier, have a disproportionate amount of wealth at this point, which I would say when you have so much wealth, that indicates you're underregulated, right? Someone hasn't been able to figure out how to tax you. Okay, because what is the purpose of having wealth that is beyond your ability to legally spend, right? Okay, so these are some of the things that people talk about. The main thing we're going to talk about today, though, is transparency, okay, because that links into all the others, okay? So one thing to know about transparency is that it's a means and not an end, okay? And why that's important is because some people think transparency is things like understanding every single weight in trillions of weights in a neural network. I mean, that's like if you went to audit a bank and you said, tell me what each synapse in every brain of every employee is doing, right? That's not how we audit banks. So there was apparently a case where Microsoft, and I don't know the case, so I've only heard this as a rumor, but that they walked into the court and they had 2 million lines of code printed out, and they dropped it, they dropped it in the court and said, there, we're fully transparent. Nobody can understand 2 million lines of code, even if they could search it, let alone if it's printed out. How is that transparent? So there is such a thing as too much information. And if you look at the standards, the international standards committees, what they say is transparency has to include legibility, right? So it's not just that you open source your project, it's also that you make it comprehensible, right? And that's a design decision as well as a documentation decision. Okay, so yeah. Also, I forgot I added this in. This is a really lovely little book. It's not the kind of guardrails as in large language models, which is confusing. Rather, it's a metaphor about explaining how the law really works. Again, for decades, unfortunately, a lot of computer scientists assume that the law is like computer code and that you could just read it and that AI could apply it better than judges could. And if that's not true, that there's something wrong with the law and they should fix the law so it's easier to read, right? And so what these guys are trying to explain is, look, the law is part of our system for improving society. We have to constantly improve because there's constantly new challenges, right? So even if we're just trying to stay even, we have to keep improving because there's always, corrosion and changes. But in fact, sometimes we can do better. And we have been doing better I mentioned this again in the morning, sorry for a little redundancy, but from 1990 until 2020, we had been steadily reducing global inequality, steadily increasing the lifespan of humans, some pretty good indicators. The last 3 or 4 years have not been good, okay? And that doesn't look like it's only COVID, there's something else going on. But anyway, overall, we've been doing a very good job on all kinds of absolute measures of increasing the public goods and making it easier for more people to thrive. Okay, so that was just the first build. Accountability is the actual goal of transparency, okay? Because accountability is the means by which we achieve improvement. We hold some people who are powerful to account, and then they make sure that, knowing that they're going to be held to account, or retroactively, either way, they make sure to do the best thing, as we've agreed, again, through legitimate strategies. Okay. So the conjecture here, and I'm sorry that the color is not clear. At this point, this is the new idea for me, which is that the legitimacy can be the grounding for both. So legitimacy might be a way to tell, have we got the accountability and the transparency right? Okay, let me explain that a little better. Okay, one thing that happened, again, during COVID was that it was the first time I spoke sort of in Vietnam. And people were just, in the questions and answers afterwards, they're just like, you expect us to trust our government, you know? And I hadn't known. Who knew that they were like I think it was the second or third most corrupt government in the world, by the way it's measured by the, world people. I don't know who does that. So anyway, I think legitimacy is, you can think of it, among other things, as the extent to which a people perceive themselves as actually constituting their state. They're not incidental to the state, right? So they have an impact on the government and how it's governed, right? This kind of identity. Okay, so this is the paper that I mentioned. It's a draft. It was presented, and you can read the whole thing. It was presented at ACM conference, but we're trying to make it into a journal article. In fact, it might be 2 journal articles. But I'm going to give you this. This is, like I said, sort of speculative. So the intuition that I had actually earlier this year was that as we kept fighting against this idea that AI is necessarily opaque. And at one point, I suddenly realized, look, government has exactly the same problem, right? So governments are also super opaque. They're very complicated. And whether or not you can understand what they're doing is partly a decision about how they're designed, how they choose to release information, whether you are sort of emotionally willing to agree, that sort of openness to this information, as well, education, things like that. So it's actually similarly a very similar problem. And so if we think about both governments and AI need to be designed in order to produce transparency and accountability, then I thought, well, maybe, especially in the case of artificial intelligence being used within governments, which is a big concern right now in the EU, maybe the whole notion of legitimacy could be used as sort of the earthing, the grounding of what is the ultimate right amount of accountability. So can people see that their government is doing what it's doing for good reasons, right? Can they identify when there's corruption, or can they identify? This is the other problem. One of the interesting things that happened during COVID was that populism went down in every single country except the United States. Now, it's really weird and interesting to ask about the exception in the United States, but generally speaking, people suddenly saw that their government was doing something. And it's weird. I mean, as somebody who's lived through both Brexit and the first Trump election, it's weird how people would stand in the middle of a safe, clean street and say the government has never done anything for me. They didn't understand what the world would be like without the government there, right? So that's one of the questions. So part of legitimacy and part of transparency is not making these things invisible, which for a long time has been our goal. For a long time, we tried to reduce the cognitive load on people. And so a perfect government is one you don't even notice. But now, because people have some kind of power, they have to be noticing the government enough to think that it's worth paying taxes and things like that. All right, and complying with regulations. Okay, so here's the part where I never knew about this because I'm not someone, my degrees, as you heard, are in computer science and in behavioral science and psychology. So I didn't know that much about government, but it turns out that there's 2 roles for bureaucracy. One is legitimacy, so enacting So we talked about for example, the civil service. Are they enacting accurately what the legislature, the elected legislature, that what their legislative intent was? But there's this other side, which is stewardship, that you are actually loyal to the state and making sure that the founders of the state and the ideal understanding of the state that's been described is being maintained. And notice these two can possibly be in tension, right? So for example, it's convenient that I'm working in Germany right now because I can use a slightly older and better understood example than the many that might be around currently. The area of Germany that had previously been a part of Prussia, sorry about your European history here, but Prussia was a state that was famous for its excellent bureaucracies. While the Nazi Party was illegal, the formerly Prussian states were the ones that were best at keeping anti-Semitic crimes from happening, right? Then, when the Nazi Party became legal, they were the fastest ones to eradicate all the Jewish people, all right? So this is something where you say this is a powerful bureaucracy, but should it have been more faithful to the original intent of the Republic when it was founded, the Weimar Republic, or was it important that it kept track with the current legislature, I should say? Okay. So as I just mentioned, these can exist in tension. Legitimacy is derived from the sort of iron cage of bureaucratic responsibility. The idea is that you aren't able to do what you want to do. There's everybody sort of watching you, but at the same time, as a consequence of that, you aren't held individually responsible for your actions, whether the actions are the actions of the state. But the stewardship comes from the fact that there's diversity, and to the extent that there's diversity within the bureaucracy, so that people have different things, different goals, and that they can hold each other to account. All right. So the really interesting question is whether AI, and it may not actually be AI. Sometimes I think that AI is like the charismatic species, you know, like if you're trying to defend an entire rainforest and you discover one really cute thing that only lives there, you know. So I think AI is literally the face of the digital revolution sometimes. But is there anything about digital era or of artificial intelligence that compromises our ability to do these two things, right? Okay, so for the rest of it, oh yeah, there's a little drawing. I forgot about this. Let's do the drawing. So one of the things that we were thinking about within this context, in fact, one of the things that drew Chris originally to want to do this project was that there was this controversy within AI that people say, oh, you can't think of AI as only a tool. A bunch of people are attributed as thinking of AI as a tool. It's just another hammer or nail that you do things with. And other people say, no, but it has agency. And so therefore, you could think of it as replacing humans within the hierarchy. And the argument that Chris and I are making is that, well, I'm not terribly upset about calling it a tool, but the main thing is that it's amplifying, it has to amplify the power of the components of the human hierarchy. Because if you do that, if you replace people with machines, you suddenly have a loss of sovereignty, unless in the incredibly unlikely case that your legislature is the one who wrote all the software. So first of all, you have an issue of that you have to trust the providers of the software. But even if you don't, even if you did, have perfect digital sovereignty over these other agents, you still have fewer people that are accountable, really, right? Calling the AI system itself accountable when you can't, it has no motivations externally, right? So there's nothing you can do if it does the wrong thing. You've basically just replaced a person with a less transparent source of the power of determining what the AI itself does, okay? So it may be that the hierarchy will be smaller because each of the people in it is more empowered, but nevertheless, it's essential to think of the responsibility and the legitimate root of the government as being this network of humans, whether they're AI enhanced or not. Okay. It seems like there's more people every time I look around. Okay. So, yeah. So we suggest that the way to maintain this is, as I just mentioned, to try to maintain legitimate integration of AI into bureaucracies, is to maintain clear and just human lines of accountability, and then to ensure that the humans can verify the correctness and appropriateness of the AI systems. Now, this sounds complicated, but believe it or not, it's the law in the EU now. So it was written into the AI Act in its final version, and it's one of the good things that was introduced very late. If you sell AI to the EU, you have not only to have, like, say, you know, when does it work correctly, and how can you tell it's working correctly? But it has to be that the operators can check to make sure that it is in fact compliant with those just the way you've described it. So that's because otherwise it's wrong to hold the operator as responsible, because they just become some sort of sacrificial person that gets fired. But if they can't actually check and make sure the system is working correctly, then they can't possibly be accountable for it. Okay. All right. So is all this stuff possible? Okay. In order to answer that question, we need to understand a little better how AI is built. Now, unfortunately, some people lie about this. Basically, one of the people who's generally one of the nice guys, you know, machine learning professor that did good, you know, so I don't want to criticize him too much, but Andrew Ng, I have heard him get up on stage in front of very important people and say, you know, we used to program AI, but now the data programs itself. Okay. That's how he was describing machine learning, and it's how he's trying to bring in a lot of data, right? He's trying to get access to data, but it's just wrong. Okay. There's a lot of data in this room, and it isn't suddenly programming itself into something, right? So let's talk a little bit more about the process. So the process of putting a data together, or at least the discipline of putting a system together, is called systems engineering. And that discipline was actually invented in the 1940s. I don't know if I kept that. Yeah. So even before there was software, although there was already sort of computing machines. Again, I don't know if you know that the IBM helped the Nazis. Right? It was one of the things they collaborated with Hitler. But those were more like purely mechanical computing machines. So yeah, systems engineering is an interdisciplinary field of engineering and engineering management that focuses on how to design, integrate, and manage complex systems over their life cycles. And I'll skip over this part. I just want to show you, when I did my PhD back in the 90s, these were the 5 things, the 5 classes every student had to take one of, right? So theory of computation is what is actually computable. And I find it really weird that people sometimes forget that there's time. It requires time, space, and energy to compute anything. And not everything can be computed, right? Algorithms is actually similarly about, like, how do you put together solutions? Architecture is more about the actual computing machines. Artificial intelligence, I hope you guys are on top of. But systems engineering often gets neglected. But I wanted to show you, I did double check, and this is the undergraduate course curricula for EECS. Which is what my PhD is technically in, although don't ask me an electrical engineering question. And you can see right here, there's still computer systems engineering, but not even that. Look at this also up here, that there's also elements of software construction. So absolutely still trying to get this across. All right, so let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail, right? When you design a software system, you have to think of the architecture of the software, not the architecture of the hardware necessarily. But what are the different kinds of modules that you want to do what, okay? And you think about what are the inputs going to be? Even if that's data, you're still saying, well, what data are we using? But it's never just data, isn't it? There's also prompts. There's all kinds of context that's out on the web right now. There could be content, you know, satellites, whatever. There's outputs. I've heard people say, you can't, I'm just noticed I'm going much too slow. But I heard somebody say, what if you had and this is somebody from the future of life, so a big deal institute that gets lots of money from, in fact, Musk, and is at initially, and is at the MIT now too. What if you were trying to make a computer learn how to play chess, and it noticed that you turned it off at night, and it shot you? Okay, what? No chess computer is connected to a gun, right? If you're building a chess program, why would you add a gun onto it? That doesn't make any sense. Chess computers don't even have hands usually. Maybe they could move the chess pieces around, but also they don't have a concept of night and day, right? If you look at how games are played, that you only have the board and the chess piece and the pieces, right? And also, no computer scientist doing machine learning ever turns off their computer at night. That's when you want it to do the work, so that you don't have to use, spare the cycles. It's completely ignorant statement. Anyway, so yeah, inputs, outputs, success criteria we talked about before. How do you know it's ready for release? And the development strategy. Integration, you tend to build things out of components. I've done some evaluating for the European Research Organization on AI. If they say that the integration is going to happen the last 6 months of a 5-year project, throw it in the trash right away. That never works, right? Integration is a really hard problem. It's a good idea to decompose hard problems into smaller pieces, but you have to make sure from the beginning the small pieces are going to work together, right? Management is not only about making sure that things are working in a system once you sold it, but that they keep working. How are you going to maintain the system? How are you going to do upgrades, right? So responsibility doesn't end at sale. The complex system just basically means that there's lots of interacting components, that there may be multiple conflicting goals, all kinds of things like that. The different components have different life cycles. And then, as I mentioned, complex systems may evolve or develop or fail and collapse, and new versions may replace or supplement original. Okay, so this is like 5 ways of doing systems engineering. I'm sorry to do, it's a little boring, but I think it's important to get the idea. Back in the old days, really at the beginning, people would bring in and say, what do you want us to do? And the programmers would be told what to do, and they'd go away and make the software. And then they'd come back and they'd be, wow, that's not what we wanted at all, right? And so then the programmers invented this thing called the waterfall system, where they say, no, once you've told us the requirements, that is a contract and you don't get to change your mind again. Okay, so so there's the requirements, and then there's a design phase, and then there's the implementation phase, and then you verify it. And then I guess you release it after you verify it, because then it goes into maintenance, right? There are still people who talk about the waterfall, but it's usually used, I mean, it says 2005 here, but it's from the 70s. It is not, people still talk about it, but it is usually used as a straw man. This was a big deal. Again, it actually was innovated around 1990, the corkscrew method. But the figure is from Westerhoff. Can anyone notice anything strange about this figure? Put your processing hat on. Is there anything really strange going on? Yes, exactly. That makes no sense whatsoever. Please. It should be after you've evaluated the tests and said it's okay. That's when you deploy. I don't know what's going on with Westerhoff there. Okay. So, and then this is kind of funny. I should have probably thrown it, but it's basically the waterfall, but say you do it again. Okay. And then finally, this is the sort of the contemporary thing, although it's from 2000. The Agile Manifesto came out in 2000. But you do it iteratively. You have quick meetings, small groups. You do it always with user development. You constantly test and release, right? And I'm sorry, you constantly test. When you release, is just you suddenly say, okay, that's good enough. Again, remember what I said before about the people that were writing 5-year projects and then trying to make it work at the end. This is saying, no, you constantly have a version of it that you could be testing. And then at some point you say, oh, the tests are good enough, and you let the public have access. All right. And then you write the tests before you write the code. right? So that you really focus on what does success look like, okay? And then there's this model about embrace change. The reason that the people, when they get the software back, it's not just that they described it badly. It's just that it's hard to know how your whole business process is going to work. There's this famous thing about like when they first invented Xerox machines, you know, the photocopiers, that they thought, how much will people be willing to pay? And they said, well, how much are people paying for carbon paper? Do you guys even know what carbon paper is? You used to type things and make copies by having a piece of paper and then a piece of carbon, and then another piece of paper. So you could get like 5 copies at once. But that is as many as you could get. And so of course you didn't have very many copies because you could only get 5 at a time, right? It worked better for 3, right? Of course, as soon as you had a photocopier, people made way more copies, right? And so that was a complete misunderstanding of what people could do once they got the technology. All right, so this is a picture again from a few years ago now. But the point that's important is that the way Facebook works is that every single person that has access to the code base at all is empowered to change the main code base, right? Constantly. So constantly the tests are running and checking if anything is going weird with Facebook, which makes sense because that also is cybersecurity, okay? But basically, you make changes. There's like sandboxes or whatever that test a little bit. And then you say, okay, I think it's okay. And you make a commit. And then your new version of the key software goes out to employees. So if you work for Facebook, it's literally your job to play with Facebook at work, right? So if the employees don't notice anything, it goes to 2% randomly chosen of the world, right? And then if nothing very bad happens, it gets released to the whole world. But the point is, you know, back in the 1990s, it was considered completely radical that Microsoft did builds at the end of the week, right? Nobody was allowed to go home on Friday until everything works together, right? That was considered outrageous. You know, all these professional computer scientists were saying, this will never work. There's something really wrong here. But now the individuals are putting the code directly into work, okay? All right, so you might think, but she's talking about stuff before large language models. No, I'm not, okay? Jeff Hinton is an absolute genius. I don't want to take away, I don't agree with what he says. He doesn't know that much about governance and regulation and human society, but he knows a lot about machine learning. And this is one of the most beautiful papers. I mean, he wrote a lot of beautiful papers, but this one, when they really, really figure out how to get deep learning working in 2006, a lot of the world changed in 2006 and 7 with the smartphones too. Some people think that there was like a revolution there that got kind of dwarfed by the 2008 financial crash. But looking back in history, we're going to say, whoa, the world really pivoted then. But this was part of what that was about. So they really figured out how to do this. But if you read the paper, it's all about exactly how many layers do you have? Exactly when do you train which ones? When are they exposed to each other? When do you lock down which layer? When do you allow which layer to keep going, right? This is, so yeah, I don't want to go on too much about this. Yeah, so this is what I was just telling you. Deep learning really took off when we figured out good methods to do this. So there's still programming, even if we're not programming exactly how the system behaves, how we construct the system is still subject to engineering, okay? And then of course the hardware changes too. Okay, now that we have, you know, so that's exactly what's underlying how the foundation models get built. But don't forget that it's not only that we have deep learning, it's an enormous, enormous ecological cost, right? And it takes months and it takes huge amounts of data, right? And someone has to decide. So part of making the system work is acquiring the power sources, right? Facebook is trying to get permission to build small modular nuclear reactors, like innovate new kinds of nuclear reactors, right? So that is also part of the systems engineering. And then what you're doing when you're doing generative AI is you're just retrieving predictions, right? So if you look at the internet, if you say a certain kind of thing, what was the most likely next thing you were going to say? Well, unfortunately, there's some bad people in some parts of the internet. And so there's also these things called guardrails. So they're basically an extra amount of weight that's added on to the top part, the prompts and everything, right? And then those are often trained using reinforcement learning or even brute force. And there's some big articles showing just the enormous number of people that are being used. And again, someone chooses not only to hire those guys, but tells them what to do, right? Says like, how do we know this is okay? And also says, when is it good enough to release to the public? So at what point is this going to work? So all this is going on behind every AI system. All right. So now if we're thinking about how to govern that, the kind of transparency that matters for governance is easy. It's not to say that we can easily govern every digital system, but if we build the digital systems in the right way, we can govern them. A lot of what we're doing, as I mentioned, is we're not auditing the synapses of the bankers. We are auditing their accounts, right? So we're looking at the human behavior when they build, train, test, deploy, and monitor it, right? So maintainable systems engineering will involve this architecting, as I just mentioned. You have to secure the system, right? There has to be cybersecurity, or else any system that's not cyber secure, talking about trusting it, talking about having a reliable system is nonsense, right? Okay, so you secure the system, you include including all its logs, and also the provenance of software. We were talking a little bit earlier today about whether software is a service. One of the reasons people think software is a service, which it isn't, right? The software, writing software is a service, software can perform a service, but software itself is a product. But people say, but there's no other product where it changes all the time because of the libraries that are online or whatever. Look, that's like somebody saying, it's not our fault if we build a bridge and the concrete turns out to be really cheap, crappy concrete and it falls down 20 years later. No, it was your fault. It is part of your job as an architect to go out, as a civil engineer, to go out and check the quality of your ingredients, of your, now this is, I think the battery is going on this. So I'm going to sit down. Sorry about that. Oh, thank you. Duh. Okay, great. So where are we? Right. So yeah, I much prefer looking this way. Okay, I'll turn around this. Hi guys. So yeah, and then you need to log with secure revision control every change that you make to the code base. However you're changing this, like I said, there was code, even if the code is prompt, it's still code. You keep track of why, where, and when. This stuff was like rocket science in about 1980. Okay, it is not rocket science anymore. This is standard practice in software. And yet a lot of AI companies don't bother to do it. Okay. So, oh, I forgot what else. Yeah. And of course, logs of the testing too. So you can demonstrate that you put enough effort into making sure that the system was working, was compliant with your standards before you released it. Okay. All of this stuff benefits the developers themselves, right? It makes it easier to maintain the system, but it's also auditable. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, that's I never use memes, but this is my first meme that I truly love. All right. Okay. So let's get an example here. This is so in 2017, Eileen Caliscan, Arvind Narayana, and I put out a paper that got into Science about bias. And what you see here is if you translate from a language that doesn't have gender into a language that does have gender, the same word gets translated differently depending on what the verb is involved, right? So, and why is that? It's not because the system itself thinks something about women. It's that on the internet, the word she is more likely than the word he in a sentence about laundry, okay? It's not the way the world should be, it's the way the world is. That's just what is happening on the internet. And so any system that's built by reading data is going to reflect the world we live in, okay? All right, so that's the translator. Now you might say, how do you build this? As I just explained to you, if the machine learning system is correct, and then it should match the data, right? It's a simple, clean, clear system. Now, some people, after we wrote that paper, I got all the references. You know, when you cite it, you get emails about it. So many people went in and tried to change this. And the thing is, if they can change that, they can also start putting in like political persuasion or advertisement persuasion or whatever else. So if we're going to have something that's auditable, we want to know that we're replicating the actual data, right? And so as a consequence, we know we're going to get the stereotyped output like I just showed you, okay? If you can decide what fair is, and that is super hard, it is non-trivial. But once you decide what fair is, you could then have something else that goes in between it. So you could do something that really is, explainable AI that's, old school, readable stuff. Or you could do machine learning, or even the stupid stuff they're doing with reinforcement learning by humans. But it needs to be simple and transparent, and then that should also be auditable. So the whole thing should be thought of as a translator. And part of the reason I made this slide is that some people don't want any like stereotypes anywhere in the system, that they have this contamination model of AI. But that if you don't have, for example, some of the most nasty language can come from minority groups. And if you don't include their language in the training, then you're not going to be able to support those groups when they're talking to the system. So it makes more sense to have this more compound kind of model. Okay, so each stage should be auditable and replicable, so we can check, would it really go that way? Each stage should be demonstrably meet whatever the criteria was that was supposed to be set. So this is what the EU is actually doing. So in the Digital Services Act and the AI Act, we require process audits. We do not audit the code. We do not audit the weights. Although if you want to provide the code as part of your evidence, if you can do that in a transparent way that like lawyers can understand, fine, great, okay. But generally speaking, we're looking to see the process audits. Okay, I already said that to you. Okay, so now I'm doing pretty well, except you guys haven't asked any questions because we're finishing in 10 minutes, right? Okay, I'll go really quickly through the 12 guidelines for responsible generative AI use, and then you guys can ask questions, which could include go back more slowly. Okay, so I'm going to start with 2. We'll get back to why in a minute. So the idea is that, okay, now I'm going to change. I don't want to. I might not read all of these to you because I don't think that important. But it's very important to understand that generative AI is not a source of facts, especially about itself. It's a source of predictions, right? So any prediction that comes out of generative AI has to be tested. It's often wrong, and the predictions are nonsense, and the stuff that you're used to using as an indicator of how good it is isn't there. Because all the text it's trained on, almost all the text, is going to be produced by confident people. And so it sounds really, really confident, right? And as we know now, a lot of the guardrails are being put on it, try to be, I can't even say this word, and I'm a native English speaker, sycophantic. Anyway, it tries to make you, to build you up, right? So that is weird stuff that's been added on to that. These are incidentally available from my blog. So you can, if you go to any of my blog posts, right now, this is the most popular one. So if you click on any of my blog posts, then recommended, this will be the top one. So yeah, you can't, and this is another form of hazard with AI. People think that with humans, it's true. How much time you'll spend talking to someone is an indication of how much you value them, all right? But with AI, that's not true at all, right? It doesn't get bored. It can talk to you forever, and people believe they're building up a relationship, and they can be training more expectations so that it works a little better with them. So it is sort of like a human relationship, but the cost is negligible to the company that's providing the AI. It is not an indication that the AI is now invested in you. It's only an indication that you are now invested in it because you spent all that time training it. Okay. AI itself can't be held to account. I guess you guys read that paper already, and we talked about that a little earlier. It's important for you to understand that if you use AI, you are the one who's accountable for whatever it produced. So this is part of the reason I wrote this blog post, is because there was a student, I thought she was a PhD student, but thank goodness she was actually a master's student that was exchange student. But she was coming to me with a abstract that she'd written, and she wanted to know if it was okay to send it to a conference I had recommended, and it was terrible, you know. And I said, well, what if this doesn't make sense? That doesn't make sense. And she's like, but ChatGPT wrote it. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, that's totally irrelevant, right? You're asking my opinion about this text. It is now your text that you wrote. So, and I was never saying that you were a bad person for having written. I'm just telling you the abstract itself has issues that you need to correct before you submit it, right? So yeah, so remember that there isn't another agency that you can blame, right? You cannot, even if you are allowed to use generative AI, you can't then say, but the generative AI said that, right? I would argue, and this is the same, this happened on the same day. This is a dispute with the head of one of the main German law schools, but he had basically, he was sure he was right because he'd hired some PhD students that had been working for DeepMind, you know, so like Google's OpenAI, right? You know, super smart people, but, you know, they told him, this is how AI works. Now, they often say it, this is how AI works. They mean generative AI. They said there's no way that we can reliably recall an individual case. Rather, we now just get these sort of averages over cases, you know? And he's like, oh, so we have to change the law to handle that. It's like, what are you talking about? We already had a system of law where we could go back to the original case. Having some kind of weird averaged case can often miss out the subtlety and the important pieces, right? And also, I don't have that in this talk, but I'll show it tomorrow. You don't get and you don't want, you know, the absolute best performance of humans out of generative AI because you don't want anything too eccentric. Remember, we're worried about like the random stuff on the internet. So you tend to get better than average human performance, but not the best performance. It's like 75, 80 percentile performance. Again, that's not usually when you're referencing cases in the law, you're referencing the best cases out of the law, right? They stand out for some reason. So, you know, it's just wrong to use generative AI in this context. And you need to remember that even if you're fully digitalized, there were perfectly good other, you know, normal ways to do search and get out the cases that you know, get assistance in finding the cases. All right. I sort of already said this. If you're blaming AI, it's like blaming the typewriter. Okay, don't do that. We talked about this a little bit this morning with the PhD students. Oh no, I think this is over lunch. Anyway, somebody talked to me about this earlier today, and it's totally irrelevant to you. I apologize for having mentioned that. The purpose of education is personal improvement. So you need to be a more skilled and knowledgeable person. Yes, one of those skills may be using generative AI well, but nevertheless, that's not the hardest thing to learn, right? I think it's important that sometimes you practice and you rehearse and you learn things and you have individual autonomy. So you have to be careful about the overuse of generative AI. For example, for writing, it really is an interesting process to write a long text yourself. I already just said this after 6. Overuse of AI may leave you vulnerable and incompetent without it. And this is particularly at the organizational level. I was just talking to NATO about this, right? You can't expect there will always be electricity. You cannot expect there will always be access to the internet. The most recent time anyone blew up a nuke in space, it was the United States decided to do a space nuclear test. It knocked out 75% of the satellites, right? And yeah. So anything could happen. And so while it's great to use generative AI to build up a process and to learn things and to develop an understanding, you don't want it in essential, you know, things that you need to be able to do quickly. You need to be able to have more reliable systems than that. Okay. Yeah, remember, and it's weird, my students tell me, yeah, we kind of know this. Correcting or fact checking generative AI can take longer than just doing it yourself. But they're like, yeah, but somehow they enjoy more telling you something to do the same task over and over and over in different ways than sitting down and doing it themselves. And it's funny because programmers always used to joke about this, that we would rather sit down and write code to do something than do it ourselves, because we hope that in the future we can reuse the code, right? But maybe we were also like this, that somehow we enjoyed having this slave that would do things for us. I don't know. But now that I see students, because once you've got the prompt, you don't reuse it, right? So that it really is just about that process. And here is 12 and 1. You don't actually have to use generative AI. Remember that there's alternatives. Okay, so that's the whole talk. In summary, accountability is essential to a resilient society. It's the means of improvement. Transparency is not an end in itself, but a means to facilitate that improvement. Transparency of different types at different levels can facilitate law, systems engineering, and usability. I didn't really talk about that much, but I didn't talk about it at all. I'm just talking about it now in the conclusion, which is actually bad practice. But anyway, the IEEE actually specifies like 4 different levels of transparency. One for the people that are trying court cases, which we've mostly been talking about here, but one for the actual developers, one for the ordinary users, and maybe possibly also for professionals that are helping, situate AI that the user won't really understand. And maybe it's also useful for legitimacy might be a part of this. That was speculative, as I mentioned. And then finally, of course, be careful how or even if you use generative AI. Okay, thanks.